The morning sun was barely peeking through the glass walls of the most exclusive conference room in Silicon Valley. Inside, 30 of the world's wealthiest tech leaders were gathering for what many called the most important meeting of the year. The room itself told a story of success: Italian marble floors, handcrafted furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Each chair around the massive oak table was worth more than what most people earn in a month. One by one, the titans of technology walked in. The founder of a social media giant that connected billions of people stepped out of his custom Tesla. The creator of an online marketplace that changed how the world shops arrived in a car that cost more than most houses. These weren't just rich people. They were the architects of the digital age, men who had turned lines of code into empires worth hundreds of billions of dollars. They moved with the confidence that comes from knowing you've changed the world. Their conversations were peppered with numbers that seemed impossible. Millions of users, billions in revenue, market caps that defied imagination. The air was thick with expensive cologne and the kind of casual arrogance that money and power tend to breed. But then something different happened. A man walked into the room, and everything about him seemed wrong for this setting. He didn't arrive in a luxury car with tinted windows. He didn't have an assistant carrying his briefcase or whispering schedules into his ear. He simply walked in, wearing a plain button-down shirt that looked like it came from any regular store, not some designer boutique. This was Sundar Pichai, though most people in the room didn't really know who he was yet. Sure, they knew he worked at Google, but Google had thousands of employees. To them, he was just another engineer, another face in the crowd of technical people who built the things that made them rich. What they didn't know was the story behind this quiet man. Sundar had grown up in a small apartment in Chennai, India, where space was so tight that he and his brother slept on the living room floor. His father worked for a British company, earning just enough to keep the family comfortable, but never wealthy. They didn't own a car until Sundar was in college. They didn't even have a telephone at home until he was 12 years old. When that first phone finally arrived, it was like magic to young Sundar. He would sit next to it for hours, memorizing every number his family dialed. He could remember dozens of phone numbers perfectly, long after others had forgotten them. It was an early sign of the incredible memory and attention to detail that would later help him navigate the complex world of technology. But success didn't come easy. When Sundar first got the chance to study in America, his father had to spend more than a year's salary just to buy him a plane ticket. The family had to borrow money and make sacrifices that would take years to recover from. They bet everything on their son's potential, not knowing if he would succeed or fail in a foreign country thousands of miles away. Now, 15 years later, that same young man was sitting in a room with people who could buy small countries. Yet as he looked around the table, Sundar didn't seem impressed or intimidated. He had learned something during his journey from Chennai to Silicon Valley that money couldn't teach. He understood that technology wasn't really about the technology at all. It was about people. The other men in the room were discussing the latest trends, throwing around terms like disruption and innovation like magic spells. They talked about user acquisition costs and market penetration rates. Everything was numbers. Everything was strategy. Everything was about winning and beating the competition. Sundar listened quietly, occasionally nodding, sometimes taking notes in a simple notebook, not on some expensive tablet or laptop, just paper and pen. The other executives had teams of people taking notes for them, but Sundar preferred to write things down himself. It helped him think, helped him process what was really being said beneath all the business jargon. As the morning wore on, something strange started to happen. The conversations kept coming back to the same problems. How do you reach the next billion users? How do you make technology work for people who don't have the latest smartphones or fastest internet connections? How do you build products that matter beyond just making money? These were questions that most people in the room had never really had to think about. They built products for people like themselves, wealthy, connected, living in cities with perfect internet and unlimited data plans. The idea that billions of people around the world were struggling with basic connectivity issues seemed like someone else's problem. But for Sundar, these weren't abstract business challenges. These were personal memories. He remembered what it felt like to have limited access to information, to have technology that only sometimes worked, to dream about possibilities that seemed impossibly far away. He thought about his mother, who had to walk to the market every day because they couldn't afford a car. He thought about his father, who spent his entire career working for someone else's company, never having the opportunity to build something of his own. He thought about all the brilliant people he had known growing up who never got the chance to show the world what they could do simply because they didn't have access to the right tools or opportunities. As the meeting continued, Sundar realized something that would change everything. The people in this room weren't just missing a business opportunity. They were missing the entire point of why technology mattered in the first place. They had become so focused on competing with each other that they had forgotten about the billions of people who could benefit from what they were building. The quiet engineer from Chennai was about to teach some of the world's most powerful people something they had never learned in all their years of success. He was about to show them that the future of technology wasn't about building bigger, faster, or more expensive products. It was about building bridges. Bridges that could connect every person on Earth to the tools and information they needed to build better lives for themselves and their families. But first, he had to find the right moment to speak. And when that moment came, everything would change. The conversation in the room had been going on for nearly 2 hours when someone said something that made Sundar's pen stop moving across his notebook. One of the most successful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, a man who had funded dozens of billion-dollar companies, was explaining why web browsers were becoming irrelevant. "Look, the future is mobile apps," the investor said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about technology trends. "Nobody uses browsers anymore. Everything is happening in apps now. Instagram, Snapchat, Uber, that's where people spend their time. Browsers are dead technology, just like CD players and fax machines." Heads around the table nodded in agreement. These were smart people, after all. They had built their fortunes by spotting trends before anyone else did. And the numbers seemed to support what he was saying. People were downloading billions of apps and spending hours every day scrolling through social media feeds and ordering food with the tap of a button. But as Sundar listened to this conversation, something didn't sit right with him. He thought about his own experience, about the millions of people who couldn't afford the latest smartphones, who didn't have unlimited data plans, who lived in places where downloading huge apps was impossible because the internet was too slow or too expensive. The room had moved on to discussing which app categories would be most profitable in the coming years. Gaming, social media, e-commerce. Everyone had opinions about where the smart money should go. But Sundar was thinking about something completely different. He was thinking about a classroom he had visited just a few months earlier in rural India. The teacher there had shown him how she was using a simple web browser on an old computer to access educational content for her students. The computer was probably 5 years old, running slowly, but through that browser 30 kids could learn about science, mathematics, and literature from some of the best teachers in the world. There was no way that old computer could have run the latest apps, but the browser worked perfectly. Sundar cleared his throat softly. The room didn't notice at first. They were too deep in their discussion about App Store optimization and user acquisition costs. But then he spoke, and something in his voice made everyone stop talking. "I think we might be looking at this differently," he said, his Indian accent still noticeable even after all his years in America. "When we talk about browsers being dead, I wonder if we're thinking about the same people who use technology." The venture capitalist who had dismissed browsers looked slightly annoyed. This wasn't how these meetings usually went. Technical people were supposed to listen, maybe answer some specific questions about how things worked, but they weren't supposed to challenge the business strategy discussions. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice polite but clearly not expecting to be corrected by someone he didn't recognize. Sundar stood up slowly. He wasn't a tall man, and he didn't have the commanding presence that some of the other executives in the room possessed. But when he started talking, something shifted in the atmosphere. "I've been working on Chrome for the past few years," he began, "and I've learned something interesting. We think about browsers as just another piece of software, but for billions of people around the world, The browser isn't just software, it's their entire computing experience. He walked over to the large screen at the front of the room and began drawing a simple diagram. Not with fancy presentation software, just with a basic marker on a whiteboard. The billionaires in the room were used to elaborate presentations with professional graphics and detailed charts, but Sundar's simple drawings somehow captured their attention more than any polished slideshow could have. Think about it this way, he continued, sketching a simple representation of the world. In San Francisco or New York, people have powerful phones, fast internet, and they can download any app they want. But what about the student in Bangladesh who shares one computer with 50 other people? What about the small business owner in Nigeria who can't afford to buy new hardware every 2 years? The room was quiet now. These were perspectives that simply didn't come up in most Silicon Valley discussions. The people in this room lived in a bubble where everyone had the latest technology, where slow internet was just an inconvenience, not a barrier to opportunity. Sundar continued drawing, adding more details to his simple diagram. For these people, the browser isn't competing with apps, it's the platform that makes everything possible. Through a browser, that student in Bangladesh can access the same educational resources as someone at Harvard. That business owner in Nigeria can sell products to customers around the world. One of the social media company founders leaned forward. But browsers are limited, he argued. You can't do the same things in a browser that you can do with a native app. The performance isn't there, the features aren't there. Sundar smiled slightly. This was exactly the kind of thinking he had been expecting. That's true today, he agreed, but it doesn't have to be true tomorrow. What if I told you that we're working on making browsers so powerful that the difference between a web app and a native app disappears completely? Now he had their full attention. These were people who understood technology well enough to know that if someone could actually accomplish what Sundar was describing, it would change everything. We call them progressive web apps, Sundar explained, writing the term on the whiteboard. They work offline. They can send notifications. They can access your camera and location, basically everything a native app can do, but they run in a browser. And here's the important part. They work on any device, with any operating system, regardless of how old or cheap that device might be. The implications were starting to sink in around the room. If browsers could really do everything that apps could do, then the expensive app development process that had made many of these men rich might not be necessary anymore. A single web application could reach every person on Earth who had access to any kind of internet connection. But Sundar wasn't finished. He turned back to face the room, and his voice took on a passion that surprised everyone there. This isn't just about technology, he said. This is about opportunity. Right now, if you want to reach users in emerging markets, you have to build separate apps for different platforms, optimize them for slower connections, and hope people have enough storage space to download them. But with the web, there are no barriers. Someone in rural India can access the same tools as someone in downtown Manhattan. The venture capitalist who had started this whole discussion was staring at the whiteboard, clearly thinking through what he had just heard. You really think browsers can become that powerful? He asked. Sundar nodded. I don't think it, he said quietly. I know it, because we're already building it. The room had gone completely silent after Sundar's explanation about progressive web apps. You could almost hear the gears turning in these billionaires' minds as they tried to process what they had just learned. But Sundar wasn't done yet. In fact, he was just getting started. He walked back to his chair and pulled out his phone. Not the latest model, just a regular smartphone that anyone could buy. What I've told you about browsers is just the beginning, he said, holding up the device. But let me show you what else we're working on that might change how you think about technology altogether. The founder of the e-commerce giant raised an eyebrow. More revolutionary than making browsers as powerful as apps? He asked with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Sundar smiled that quiet smile of his. Much more. He put his phone back in his pocket and walked over to the window, looking out at the San Francisco Bay. How many of you have heard of Project Loon? A few hands went up around the room, but most people looked confused. Project Loon wasn't something Google talked about much in public yet. It was still experimental, still being tested, still sounding too crazy for most people to believe. "We're putting balloons in the sky," Sundar said simply, turning back to face the room. "High-altitude balloons that float in the stratosphere and beam internet down to Earth." One of the social media founders laughed. "Balloons? Like party balloons?" "Not exactly," Sundar replied, and there wasn't even a hint of defensiveness in his voice. "These balloons are the size of tennis courts. They float about twice as high as commercial airplanes fly, and each one can provide internet access to an area about the size of Switzerland." The laughter stopped. The room was paying attention again. Sundar continued, his voice getting more animated as he spoke. "Right now, about half the people on Earth don't have access to the internet. Not because they don't want it, but because the infrastructure doesn't exist where they live. Running cables and building cell towers in remote areas costs billions of dollars, and the companies that could afford to do it don't see enough profit potential to make it worth their while." He walked over to the whiteboard again and started drawing a simple map. "But what if we could bring internet access to these places without building a single tower or running a single cable? What if we could reach people in the Amazon rainforest, in rural Africa, in remote islands in the Pacific?" The venture capitalist who had been so confident about browsers being dead was now leaning forward in his chair. "How long do these balloons stay up?" "Each balloon can stay in the air for about 6 months," Sundar answered. "And we can control where they go by adjusting their altitude to catch different wind currents. It's like having a fleet of internet satellites, but much cheaper and much more flexible." But even as he was explaining Project Loon, Sundar could see that some people in the room were still thinking about this as just another business opportunity. How much would it cost? What would the profit margins be? How could they monetize users in developing countries who didn't have much money to spend? "Here's the thing," Sundar said, seeming to read their minds. "This isn't about making money from people who can't afford to pay much. This is about giving people opportunities they've never had before." He told them about a test they had run in Kenya, where Project Loon balloons had provided internet access to rural areas for several months. "We saw farmers using the internet to check crop prices in distant markets, so they knew they were getting fair deals for their produce. We saw students accessing online courses from universities they could never afford to attend. We saw small business owners setting up online stores and selling their products to customers hundreds of miles away." The room was captivated now. These weren't just technical achievements, they were human stories. But Sundar wasn't finished. "Project Loon is just one example," he said. "We're also working on self-driving cars." This got everyone's attention, immediately. Self-driving cars were the holy grail of Silicon Valley at the time. Every major tech company was pouring billions of dollars into autonomous vehicle research, trying to be the first to crack the code. "But we're not thinking about self-driving cars the same way everyone else is," Sundar continued. "Most companies are trying to build cars that rich people will want to buy. Cars with luxury interiors and premium features. We're thinking about something different." He drew another simple diagram on the whiteboard, this time showing a basic car shape. What if self-driving cars weren't about ownership at all? What if they were about access? Imagine if you could call a self-driving car with your phone, and it would pick you up and take you wherever you needed to go, for a price that anyone could afford. One of the investment fund managers spoke up. "That's just Uber with self-driving cars." "Not exactly," Sundar replied. "Uber works great if you live in a big city with lots of drivers. But what about rural areas? What about places where there aren't enough people to make it profitable for human drivers? Self-driving cars could provide transportation access to millions of people who currently have no way to get around." He told them about elderly people in small towns who had lost their ability to drive safely, but had no public transportation options. About people with disabilities who couldn't operate regular vehicles. About families in developing countries who had never owned a car but could benefit enormously from occasional access to transportation. "And here's the really interesting part," Sundar added. "The same technology that makes cars drive themselves can make them incredibly safe. We're not just talking about convenience, we're talking about saving lives. In the United States alone, about 40,000 people die in car accidents every year. Most of those accidents are caused by human error. Self-driving cars could reduce that number to almost zero. The room was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. These were people who were used to thinking about technology in terms of market opportunities and competitive advantages. But Sundar was talking about technology as a way to solve fundamental human problems. Then he dropped the biggest bombshell of all. "But the project I'm most excited about," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "is artificial intelligence." Every person in the room sat up straighter. AI was the buzzword that everyone was throwing around, but most people were still trying to figure out what it actually meant for their businesses. "We think AI is going to be more important than electricity or fire," Sundar said simply. The boldness of that statement took everyone's breath away. More important than electricity? More important than fire? These were technologies that had literally transformed human civilization. "But here's what I think most people are getting wrong about AI," Sundar continued. "They're thinking about it as a way to replace human workers, to make businesses more efficient, to cut costs. That's not what excites me about AI." He paused, looking around the room at faces that were hanging on his every word. "What excites me is the possibility that AI could make every person on Earth smarter, more capable, more creative than they have ever been before." The words hung in the air like electricity before a storm. AI could make every person on Earth smarter, more capable, more creative than they've ever been before. Sundar had just made a statement that challenged everything these billionaires thought they knew about artificial intelligence and business success. The founder of the largest cloud computing company in the room was the first to break the silence. He leaned forward, his expensive watch catching the light as he gestured. "That sounds beautiful, Sundar, but let's talk about reality. AI development costs billions of dollars. The research, the computing power, the talent, it's incredibly expensive. How do you make money if you're just giving this technology away to everyone?" It was the question everyone in the room was thinking but hadn't dared to ask. These were people who had built their fortunes by creating scarcity, by building products that people had to pay premium prices to access. The idea of making revolutionary technology freely available seemed to go against every principle of successful business. Sundar walked back to his chair and sat down, but instead of looking defensive, he seemed more relaxed than he had all day. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that I believe is going to become outdated," he said calmly. "Let me ask you something. When Google made search free for everyone, did we lose money or make money?" The room shifted uncomfortably. Of course, Google had made enormous amounts of money from search, but that was different. Search was supported by advertising. Everyone understood that business model. But search was just the beginning, Sundar continued. "We made Gmail free, and it became the most popular email service in the world. We made Maps free, and now it's used by over 1 billion people every month. We made Android free, and it's running on more phones than any other operating system." One of the investment managers interrupted. "But you monetize all of those through ads and data collection. What's the business model for giving away AI?" Sundar smiled that quiet smile again. "You're thinking about this backwards," he said. "You're asking how we make money from AI. I'm asking how we make AI valuable enough that the entire economy grows because of it." He stood up again and walked to the whiteboard, but this time he drew something different. It was a simple circle with arrows pointing outward in all directions. "Think about what happens when you make a powerful tool available to everyone," he said, drawing more circles around the first one. "A farmer in India uses AI to predict the best time to plant crops, and his harvest doubles. A teacher in Brazil uses AI to create personalized lessons for each of her students, and their test scores improve dramatically. A small business owner in Kenya uses AI to optimize his inventory, and his profits increase by 50%. The billionaires were listening, but some still looked skeptical. They were used to thinking about technology as something you controlled, something you owned, something you used to gain advantage over competitors. Sundar continued drawing, adding more circles and connections. Now multiply that by 1 billion people. When everyone has access to tools that make them more productive, more creative, more capable, the entire global economy grows. And when the economy grows, everyone benefits, including the companies that provided those tools in the first place. The venture capitalist who had dismissed browsers earlier raised his hand. But what about competitive advantage? If everyone has access to the same AI tools, how do companies differentiate themselves? That's the beautiful part, Sundar replied, his voice getting more animated. When everyone has access to basic AI capabilities, competition moves to a higher level. Instead of competing on who has the best AI, companies compete on who can use AI most creatively to solve real problems for real people. He told them about a project Google was working on with doctors in India. We trained an AI system to detect diabetic retinopathy, a disease that can cause blindness if not caught early. In many parts of the world, there aren't enough eye specialists to screen everyone who needs it. But with AI, a basic camera and a smartphone can provide the same level of diagnosis as an expensive specialist. The room was quiet as Sundar continued. We could have kept this technology secret, tried to build a business around it, charged premium prices for access. Instead, we're making it freely available to any doctor or clinic that wants to use it. Why? Because preventing blindness in millions of people is worth more than the profit we might make from a few thousand wealthy patients. One of the social media founders looked genuinely confused. But how do you measure success if not by profit? How do you know if your company is winning? This was the moment Sundar had been building toward all day. He put down the marker and turned to face the room directly. Let me tell you how I measure success, he said, his voice steady and clear. Last month, I got an email from a woman in Bangladesh. She told me that her daughter was able to access online courses through Chrome browser on an old computer at their local library. Those courses helped her daughter get accepted to a university with a full scholarship. That family's entire future changed because of a free browser that we built. He paused, looking around the room at faces that were now paying complete attention. I got another message from a farmer in Nigeria who used our AI tools to identify a plant disease that was threatening his crops. He was able to treat it early and save his harvest. That meant his family had enough food for the year and money to send his children to school. Sundar walked over to the window again, looking out at the San Francisco skyline. These people will never buy premium subscriptions to our services. They'll never click on expensive ads. By traditional business metrics, they're worthless customers, but their lives are better because of what we built, and that makes everything we do worthwhile. The investment fund manager who had been most skeptical spoke up again, but his tone was different now. That's inspiring, Sundar, but you still need to answer to shareholders. You still need to show growth and profits. How do you balance social impact with business reality? Sundar turned back to the room, and for the first time all day, he looked directly at each person as he spoke. Here's what I've learned in my years at Google. The projects that have made us the most money weren't the ones where we started by asking how to maximize profit. They were the ones where we started by asking how to solve the biggest problems for the most people. He walked back to his chair and sat down, but he wasn't finished talking. Search became profitable because we made it useful for everyone. Android became valuable because we made it accessible to everyone. YouTube succeeded because we made it open to everyone. The pattern is always the same. When you focus on creating value for people, financial value follows naturally. The room was completely silent now. These were some of the smartest business minds in the world, and they were hearing a philosophy that challenged everything they thought they knew about building successful companies. But here's the really important part, Sundar said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper again. In 5 years, maybe 10 years, every company in this room is going to face a choice. You can try to use AI to maximize your own profits, or you can use AI to maximize human potential. The companies that choose human potential are going to be the ones that survive and thrive in the long run. The billionaire who owned the cloud computing company leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. You're talking about completely rethinking how business works, he said finally. No, Sundar replied quietly. I'm talking about remembering why business exists in the first place. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Sundar's words, I'm talking about remembering why business exists in the first place, had hit these billionaires like a lightning bolt. They were used to being the smartest people in any room, used to having all the answers, used to being the ones who taught others about success. But here was this quiet engineer from Chennai, turning their entire worldview upside down. The founder of the e-commerce empire was the first to break the silence, but when he spoke, his voice was different than it had been all day. Softer, more thoughtful. Sundar, he said, I've been in business for 25 years. I've built companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But I've never heard anyone talk about business the way you just did. He paused, seeming to struggle with something he had never had to think about before. When I started my first company, I genuinely wanted to make life easier for people. I wanted to build something that would help families save money, help small businesses reach new customers. But somewhere along the way, it became all about the numbers. Revenue growth, market share, stock price. When did I stop thinking about the people? Other heads around the table were nodding. The venture capitalist who had been so confident about browsers being dead technology was staring at his hands. I fund about 50 companies a year, he said quietly. I ask them about their business models, their scaling strategies, their exit plans. But I can't remember the last time I asked an entrepreneur to tell me about the person whose life would be better because of what they're building. Sundar could see something happening in the room that he had hoped for, but never expected. These weren't just wealthy executives having a philosophical discussion. These were human beings remembering why they had gotten into technology in the first place. The social media founder who had built a platform used by billions of people looked up from his phone. You know what's crazy? He said. My platform connects people all over the world. I've got users in every country, speaking every language. But I spend most of my time thinking about engagement metrics and advertising revenue. When did I stop? Thinking about the human connections we're actually facilitating? Sundar nodded. It's easy to lose sight of the human impact when you're focused on growing a business, he said. But here's what I've learned. The companies that stay connected to their human purpose are the ones that build lasting success. He walked over to the whiteboard one more time and wrote down a simple equation. Technology plus human purpose. Lasting impact. Every successful technology company starts with someone trying to solve a real problem for real people, he explained. Google started because 2 graduate students wanted to organize the world's information. Facebook started because a college student wanted to help people connect with each other. Amazon started because someone wanted to make it easier for people to buy books. The investment fund manager, who had been most skeptical about giving away AI technology, raised his hand. But how do you maintain that focus as companies get bigger? How do you keep thousands of employees thinking about human impact instead of just quarterly numbers? Sundar smiled. That's actually the most important question you could ask, and the answer is simpler than you might think. He told them about something Google had started doing in their team meetings. Before we discuss any new product or feature, we ask one question. Whose life will be better because of this? Not whose engagement will increase, not whose revenue will grow. Whose actual life will improve? If we can't answer that question clearly, we don't build it. If we can answer it, then we figure out how to make it sustainable as a business. But the human impact always comes first. The cloud computing founder leaned forward. Give me an example of how that works in practice. Google Translate, Sundar replied immediately. We could have built a premium translation service, charged businesses high fees for accurate translations, made it a luxury product. Instead, we made it free for everyone. Why? Because we realized that language barriers prevent billions of people from accessing information, connecting with others, finding opportunities. He pulled out his phone and opened the app. Today, Google Translate supports over 100 languages. It helps students read research papers written in languages they don't speak. It helps immigrants communicate with doctors and teachers. It helps families separated by distance stay connected across language barriers. And here's the business result, Sundar continued. By making translation free and accessible, We helped create a more connected global economy, more international trade, more cross-cultural collaboration, more innovation happening everywhere. That growth benefits everyone, including Google. The room was completely engaged now. These weren't just business lessons. They were seeing a completely different way to think about success. But then something unexpected happened. The venture capitalist who had started the day dismissing browsers pulled out his own phone and started typing quickly. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I need to make a call. There's a company I funded last year. They're building educational software for kids in Africa. I told them to focus on monetization strategy. I think I gave them terrible advice." He stepped out of the room to make his call, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. The social media founder was sketching ideas for features that would help people have more meaningful conversations instead of just scrolling endlessly. The e-commerce billionaire was talking about programs to help small businesses in developing countries reach global markets. Sundar watched all of this happening and felt something he hadn't expected. These weren't just business plans they were discussing. These were ideas that could genuinely improve millions of lives. And they were coming from some of the most powerful people in technology. 6 months later, Sundar got the call that would change his life forever. Google's board had chosen him to be the company's new CEO. But by then, the transformation that had started in that conference room was already spreading throughout Silicon Valley. The venture capitalist had started asking every company he funded to identify the specific human problem they were solving before he would discuss their business model. The social media founder had launched a new initiative to help users build real-world communities instead of just online connections. The e-commerce billionaire had created a program providing free logistics support to small businesses in developing countries. When news broke that Sundar had become CEO of Google, reporters asked him about his plans for the company. His answer surprised everyone. "We're going to keep doing what we've always done," he said. "We're going to focus on building products that make people's lives better. The business success will follow naturally." But privately, Sundar knew that his real accomplishment wasn't becoming CEO of one of the world's most valuable companies. It was that conversation in a conference room where he had reminded some of the most powerful people in technology about something they had forgotten. Technology isn't about algorithms or profit margins or market share. Technology is about human potential. It's about giving people tools to learn, to connect, to create, to solve problems they never thought they could solve. Today, when Sundar walks into rooms full of executives and entrepreneurs, he still asks the same question that transformed that meeting years ago. Whose life will be better because of what you're building? And increasingly, the people in those rooms have good answers. The quiet engineer from Chennai had done something that seemed impossible. He had taught some of the world's wealthiest and most successful people that true success isn't measured by how much money you make, but by how many lives you improve. And that lesson was spreading, one conversation at a time, changing how an entire industry thinks about why technology matters in the first place.